Hello everyone, this is Jason Tondro and I am your instructor for World Lit, and we are here to tackle that biggest of all white whales, William Shakespeare, and specifically Hamlet. Uh, there's no way that we can cover all of Hamlet in one lecture, even if we go long. Some of the greatest minds writing today have written entire books about this play. So what I encourage you to do is to use all of that as a resource. In other words, you're going to find plenty of, for example, plot synopses or spark notes or lists of characters or all kinds of speculative articles about Hamlet on Google. I mean, you would get more than you could ever read with a single search. Well, all of that stuff becomes potential resources for you when used correctly. Remember, it's not about what you claim, it's about what you can prove. In all of these cases, if you find an argument that says something about Hamlet, the catch here is it backed up by specific reference to the text? In other words, if you argue that, for example, just to take one of the most obvious examples, that Hamlet is the story of a man who cannot make up his mind. This is the opening line of the Laurence Olivier black and white version of Hamlet, filmed in the 50s. Okay, so there's your thesis. Hamlet is a play about a man who cannot make up his mind. Okay, well, now you have to prove it. You have to go to specific points in the play and show Hamlet unable to decide, unable to make up his mind, or thinking or talking about his difficulty making up his mind, right? Until you can back up what you have to say, you're just blowing hot air. All right. Let's dive into the play really quickly. I'm going to spend one more minute talking about an issue that's related to Shakespeare but not the play, and that is the authorship controversy. This always comes up in classes. People have heard, maybe you have heard, that Shakespeare didn't really write Shakespeare's plays. Okay. Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare's plays. Okay. The idea that Shakespeare did not write these plays comes from the 18th century. 19th century. It comes from the 19th century. And it's essentially class-based. In other words, the argument goes that Shakespeare, whose father was a glover, who never went to college, could never have written plays this good. That he simply wasn't high enough born. He didn't have the education and the background to be able to write plays this good. That he was basically too poor and he didn't get enough school. Well, that's hogwash, to use a polite word. Shakespeare was a professional playwright and actor. Writing for the stage was his career. He clearly worked very hard to learn how to do it right. Arguments that he wasn't close enough to court, he wasn't in court, and so he wouldn't have been able to write with authority about courtly matters. That ignores the fact that he associated with members of the court whenever he wanted to. They came to his plays. They were his royal patrons. They, in many cases, paid his checks. Arguments that Shakespeare wasn't well educated enough fail to understand the quality of the middle school level of education that Shakespeare went to, where Shakespeare learned Latin, and he learned some Greek, and he learned some French, or he picked up French from his friends and acquaintances. He read the classics. He didn't always use them very well, and other writers who were better educated take Shakespeare to task for the way that he uses or sometimes abuses the classics. And I'm talking specifically about Ben Jonson, one of Shakespeare's contemporaries. This whole idea that Shakespeare was not rich or white or educated enough to write these great plays is based on the assumption that a working man produces an inferior product. It doesn't pass the logic test. There's no need to invent a new author when the real one will do just fine. Thank you. There's also plenty of evidence that Shakespeare wrote them, although we do not have any of the plays in his own hand. He doesn't really appear to have cared about publishing or preserving his work for the long haul. But we do have, for example, other playwrights talking about him, saying, oh, there's this new guy, Shakespeare, who everybody loves, or I went to a play, the newest play by Shakespeare, and so on. So we have plenty of evidence that he did exist and that he did write the plays, and we have no evidence that he did not. But it comes up all the time, and mostly it's interesting to us as an example of the massive cachet and value in Shakespeare. In other words, people will write arguments that, oh, Shakespeare was really Bacon, Sir Francis Bacon, or that he was really a woman, or that he was really a Jew, or he was really an Arab, or whatever. And what this shows us is not that the identity of Shakespeare is uncertain, because the identity of Shakespeare is quite well known, but rather that there's so much power and value in claiming Shakespeare that every group wants to do it. That is what we learn from this. Your book has a few pages on Introduction to Shakespeare and to the play Hamlet. Read them. They're useful. What I'm going to try to emphasize here in our lecture tonight is the interconnectedness of Hamlet with some of the other things that we've read. And you'll see Montaigne in here, and you'll see Machiavelli in here, and you'll see some of the older stuff too, things like Dante and in his portrayal of hell and purgatory, for example. This is important because there's some uncertainty about this play and some ambiguous elements to it that are unresolved, but that you can only understand because of all the reading that you have already done. We'll get to those when the time comes. One of the arguments about this play, and one of the things that critics often say makes it so unusual, is Hamlet's focus on his interior self, his interior monologue. Can we agree that you have multiple versions of yourself? You have an external self that you wear, for example, when you go to work, or when you go to school, or when you hang out with your friends. You have a version of yourself that you use when you meet your girlfriend's parents at 7 p.m. on Friday, and then you have a whole different version of yourself that you have 5 minutes after you walk out that door, and another version of yourself the next day when you're telling your friends how the date went. In all of these versions of your life, you are acting and speaking and dressing, behaving differently. Well, what's the real you? What's the real you inside? And isn't there some kind of disconnect going on between whatever the you inside is and whatever all of these other versions of you are that you're presenting? This is often considered a hallmark of modern life, that the you that you present on the outside is shaped and crafted. That is, that you have intentionally created an outside you. This is what we call exteriority or performativity. And then there's an interior you that it may not have any relation at all to the you that you decide to present to your coworkers, fellow schoolmates, parents, and friends. Hamlet, in this play, is an embodiment of that idea because he's pretending to be insane, to be mad on the outside. But in reality, he's very conflicted on the inside. He's debating and constantly thinking, and he's very logical, and he's trying to get to the bottom of a problem and trying to figure out what the proper moral and ethical response is to this problem. Meanwhile, his exterior self is going about things a whole different way with specific ends in mind. Harold Bloom is the primary person who has articulated this, for example, in his book, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, where he argues that It's basically in Elizabethan England in the late 1500s, early 1600s, that our idea of what it means to be a human being today basically is born. And the argument goes that before this time period, and I'm talking about the people that wrote all of the other literature that we were reading, like Dante and Chaucer and Virgil and Homer, that your outside self was basically the same as your inside self. That because medieval culture was united by large cultural trends like Christianity, and everybody had some cultural touchstones in common, that their outside self, the self that they portrayed to their friends and family, was the same as their self on the inside. Well, it's my humble opinion that anybody who's read Chaucer would argue the hell out of that, because every single character in Chaucer is a hypocrite, and they all have exterior selves and interior selves, and it's all about the relationship between those. So I don't personally find Hamlet to be innovative in that regard, but other writers do, and it's a common way of investigating. And if you do any reading on Hamlet, you're bound to stumble across it. It's also part of your background in your book. A second important reading of the play, and one that comes up very frequently, is the Freudian or Oedipal aspects of the play. You can see this portrayed in living color if you watch the Mel Gibson, Glenn Close version of the film, of the play, which is directed by Franco Zeffirelli, and which is probably on Netflix. In that version of the film, and in this reading of the play, Hamlet, who is 30 years old, by the way, we know that specifically in the play, is closer in age to his mother, who was probably very young when she had him, maybe no older than 16 or 17, than she is to her husband. Old King Hamlet would have been very old in this idea, because he was already an adult man when he married Gertrude. So maybe he was, maybe he was 40 or 50, and he married Gertrude, and she was 16 or 17, and she has a kid. That kid ages 30 years. She's 47, but old King Hamlet is, 70. And she's closer in age to her son, and what we get is an Oedipal sort of reading of the play, in which Hamlet's antagonism towards Claudius is partly stirred by he's jealous over Claudius, and he feels sexual attraction towards Gertrude, and he's ashamed of this, and it drives him crazy, and his anger and hatred towards Claudius is partly because he wants to be where Claudius is, which is in his mother's bed. And in different versions of this reading of the play, Gertrude returns those affections to some greater or lesser degree. Now, if you watch the Mel Gibson, Glenn Close version, remember this was back when Mel Gibson and Glenn Close were both younger, so they were both romantic leads, and they were cast as romantic leads in this play. And there's all these moments in that version of the film where they're very close to each other and sort of touching and staring, and Hamlet's very nervous around her, and he knows that he's attracted to her, but she is oblivious. This is all unspoken, because you can't add any lines to Hamlet, to Shakespeare. If you're filming this, you can't add new lines. You can only go with the lines that are there. And the fact is, this is the important part, this Oedipal version of the play is frankly not supported by the text. It's not there. It's not there. Hamlet has lots of problems with his mother, but sexual desire for her is not one of them. And she's got lots of things going on, but sexual desire for her son is not one of them. And so when you see a film version of this, it has to all be portrayed physically by the actors on the stage. So you'll see Mel Gibson sort of nervously touching Gertrude, and you'll see her sort of oblivious to the whole thing until this very critical moment later on in the play, and we'll talk about it. It comes in Act 3 or Act 4, in which he confronts her in her bedroom, and there's a lot of wrestling on the bed, sort of predictable outcome. Uh, we call this an Oedipal reading of the play because it's based on the idea of the Oedipal complex. And Freud himself used Hamlet as an example of the Oedipal complex at work. This is part of the reason why we read the play the way we do. So in your readings, if you do any more investigation on Hamlet, you will undoubtedly come across both of these aspects of the play that we've just talked about. Take them with a grain of salt. Remember that it's not what you claim, it's what you can prove. Okay? All right. Let's get straight to the play. Let's talk about Act 1. We'll break this up into acts as we go, okay? In fact, we'll stop real briefly right now after 15 minutes, and we'll come back in a minute for Act 1. Okay, we're back. Act 1 is all about setup. We have to set up the people, the place, and the basic problem. We start off with characters all standing guard duty. You'll meet a bunch of them. Most of them aren't important. The guy that is important is Horatio. Horatio is Hamlet's best friend, who's been away at school. Hamlet's trained in a university at Wittenberg in Germany. This is important because Germany was Protestant. And this issue of Protestant versus Catholicism is going to show up in the play. So Horatio is Hamlet's best friend. And Horatio shows up here on the guard duty, and they talk about a lot of things, but there's two important things that go on here. The first is they talk about the fact that Denmark is preparing for war. That everybody is building cannons and they're building ships, and the question is why is Denmark so anxious about war? We find out that the previous king, the now dead king of Denmark, whose name was also Hamlet, so we're going to call him Old King Hamlet. Old King Hamlet had made a lot of war when he was younger, and specifically against places like Norway. And he had conquered Norway, and then made Norway pay him a kind of annual tribute. Well, the ruler of Norway is now quite old, but there's a young prince in Norway whose name is Fortinbras. Now, this is important because Fortinbras is mentioned in every act of the play. He's a recurring character and a theme, but he's the first guy to get cut when you watch a film version. So in a lot of versions of Hamlet, and I really recommend that you watch a version of Hamlet. It'll really help. The BBC's got one that's on Netflix. The 4-hour-long Kenneth Branagh version has got every line of the play. There is nothing cut. It can be a great help when you're reading the play. The Mel Gibson version is more complicated. There's a lot cut. There's a lot of things rearranged. It's more like a Hamlet mashup than an actual version of the play. Anyway, Fortinbras almost always gets cut. Fortinbras is the current prince of Norway, and Fortinbras is off making war, supposedly against Poland. But there's some concern that maybe he's going to diverge his army and attack Denmark. In other words, Denmark has enemies. Norway, possibly Poland. There are threats out there, and with Old King Hamlet dead, those threats might be sensing weakness or be looking to go out and get some revenge. The other thing that happens in this introductory scene is the appearance of the ghost. Old King Hamlet's ghost is haunting the battlements of the castle. And Horatio and the other men with him, Bernardo, Marcellus, Francisco, they see the ghost and try to interact with it, but the ghost won't speak to them. And this is where they get the idea that, well, let's get Hamlet out here so he can see this thing with his own eyes. Keep your eye, we've already introduced Fortinbras. Keep your eye on this idea of fathers and sons. You're going to see a number of sons in this play and their fathers, and a lot of those fathers are going to be dead or dying. And each of those sons reacts in a different way to that death of that father. And so we should be asking ourselves, as Hamlet does, what is the proper conduct? How much should we value or honor revenge? Is revenge proper? Now, it's a silly question to ask in America, where a revenge movie is a guaranteed summer blockbuster. Here in America, we spend a lot of money on revenge. But this is exactly the question that Shakespeare is asking, and he'll be presenting you numerous sons and numerous fathers, and we'll be asking ourselves, what is the proper relationship? How should a son honor the memory of his father? What makes a prince a good prince or a bad prince? And, we're talking about princes, so obviously you're going to be thinking about Machiavelli, and that's totally relevant here. But also remember that Hamlet, although he is a prince of Denmark, his interiority, his internal reflection, and his internal thoughtfulness makes him a very good surrogate for all of us. And when Hamlet starts to wonder how a prince should act, in many ways what he's really asking is, how should we act, you and I? When we're under the gun, how should we behave? And Hamlet will look at these other sons and compare it to his own behavior and start finding some possible answers to that question. And I think that you are invited to decide if you agree or disagree with him. Scene 2 is a wedding. The end of the wedding. We've already mentioned that old King Hamlet is dead. This is Hamlet's father. But Hamlet's mother is still alive. And his father had a brother. Hamlet's uncle is named Claudius. And Claudius has married Gertrude, and we arrive at the end of the wedding, the sort of after-wedding court scene, when Claudius discusses the fact that, we're sad for our brother's death. It's tragic, and we have been in mourning for it. But enough time has gone by now, and there's enough other important things going on in the country that we decided we had to move on. And so I have married Gertrude, and we're now king and queen. Okay. There's a couple of things going on here that we should be asking ourselves. First off, why isn't Hamlet king? If Hamlet, the old King Hamlet, is dead, why doesn't the throne just go to the prince? Well, the first answer is that apparently he's been off in school. That he wasn't here to claim the throne. He doesn't particularly seem to want it for most of this play. It's not until the end that he seems to understand that he's been robbed of the throne. Secondly, apparently the power of the throne passes through Gertrude. In other words, Claudius is not king unless he marries Gertrude. She's the family line that's important here, not old King Hamlet's family line. Hamlet often uses the word incest to describe the relationship of his uncle and his mother. Now, to us today, a woman who's a widow marrying the brother of her first husband would seem pretty weird, but it's not incest. In the mind of the late 15th century, early 16th century Elizabethan playgoer, it was incest. It was a sin. You see Claudius giving out orders, talking about this business with Fortinbras, with Poland and Norway. He seems to be very competent and powerful and good at his job. He's sending off ambassadors, he's writing letters, he's arranging diplomatic treaties and planning for war. I think that we are invited to look at Machiavelli and ask ourselves if Claudius is a good prince or a bad prince. Hamlet thinks he's a bad prince, but that's because of his anger towards Claudius, and you will soon find out that Hamlet discovers that Claudius killed old King Hamlet in order to get the throne. If you ever get stuck on the plot of Hamlet, just remember the Lion King. The king of the jungle is killed by his brother, who takes over, shacks up with the queen, gets the young prince exiled. The young prince is exiled with a couple of his, where he meets a couple of sort of schoolmates who teach him about life, and he's got a crazy girlfriend, and there's a court advisor that talks too much, and then right near the end of the show, the ghost of the prince's dead father shows up and says, "Simba, you must go back," in that James Earl Jones voice. and then the prince returns home to try to kill his uncle and set things right. Of course, being a Disney movie, in this version, everybody lives, except for the bad guy who dies. In the real version, it's much more tragic. But The Lion King is basically Hamlet in the jungle, and you'll probably stumble across that too if you do Google research for more than 5 minutes. In this scene, we introduce the third of these son figures, and that is Laertes. We have Hamlet, and then Fortinbras, and now Laertes. Laertes is a young man about Hamlet's age, probably younger, who has a sister named Ophelia, who Hamlet is apparently sweet on, and who is apparently sweet on him in return. Laertes, his father, Polonius, is the talkative court advisor, the equivalent of the parrot guy from Lion King. Laertes asks Claudius to return to France. France was a place where you went to spend lots of money, drink lots of booze, and sleep with lots of women. And Laertes' desire to return to France is generally perceived as his desire to go have fun instead of hanging out in Denmark, which maybe isn't the most fun place to be. Very swiftly, most of the court disappears, and we're left with Claudius, Gertrude, and Hamlet talking about grief and Hamlet's grief over the death of his father. There's a lot of punning and language involved here. When Hamlet says something like, "I am too much in the sun," it's hard to get a vision of what these things would be like unless you watch a film version. Or you see the play performed. But right off the bat, when Hamlet talks about how Gertrude says, why is it that you seem so depressed? I'm on page 663. Why seems it so particular with thee? Why are you so depressed? And he says, well, I don't seem sad. I really am sad. You see it in the very beginning. He starts introducing this concept of exterior self versus interior self. What I seem is what I play, like an actor might play. And Hamlet's totally obsessed with acting and direction and playwriting. He's a frustrated actor. He'll actually give written advice to another actor later on in the play. This play is very much about play acting. And think of Hamlet as a sort of frustrated director, right? Where he's a character in a play, but what he really wants to do is be the guy who makes and writes the play and makes people do what he wants them to do. He's a frustrated director. He says, I don't know what you mean by seams. I know not seams. 'Tis not alone my inky cloak, good mother, nor customary suits of solemn black. It's not the things that I wear on the outside that are real. It's not my heaving sighs. It's not all of that stuff. That's all acting. What really matters is what's in here, and that is in grief for my father. For they are actions that a man might play, he says, but I have that within which passeth show. These outside things, are but the trappings and the suits of woe. A little joke there on suits, because he's been talking about people's black clothing, right? Claudius's counter-argument is, look, this is the way of life. That this is where you cue circle of life, right? That there's people die, and fathers die, and sons miss them. And if there is one common theme to literature, it's the death of fathers and the way that sons miss them. And, I respect your grief, but it's been a while, and you should get over it. He says it's actually a sin against God and against nature for you to be like this for so long. You should get on with it. He also pronounces Hamlet the heir to the throne. This just underscores the fact that he's not the king already. Why isn't Hamlet king? Claudius does note that you, Hamlet, are the heir. If I die, you get the kingdom, and he makes it a point that everybody knows this. This scene also exposes us to the general insult leveled against all Danes, which is that they're all drunkards. We have this idea that every culture, kind of every race or nationality kind of has their own problem. Maybe they're too lazy or they're too greedy or whatever. I mean, these are all really ugly stereotypes. We still use them today, even when we shouldn't. The reputation that the people of Denmark had was that they were all drunk. They all drank too much. And you see this in Claudius. He often is talking about how much he wants to drink or how much he needs to drink, how much he takes excuses to drink. In this case, he goes off, he's let off to drink, to celebrate. This leaves Hamlet and Gertrude alone for a moment, and they also talk about Hamlet's desire to leave. Just like Laertes was getting ready to leave and go off to France, Hamlet was getting ready to leave and go back to Wittenberg, to college. Gertrude and Claudius don't want him to go. They want him to stay and help help the new kingdom, sort of go off on the right foot, and to help them out with running things. And he agrees to stay. Then we get his first big soliloquy. And I'm looking on the bottom of 664. Oh, that this too sullied flesh would melt. Hamlet's soliloquies are done when he is alone on the stage. When he has no one else to lie to, Hamlet is honest. This is a characteristic of the soliloquy on Shakespearean stage. There's just you. You don't have anybody to perform for, so you can afford to be honest. And this is when he, quote, unpacks my heart with words, when he starts talking about the things that he's really thinking about and what's really got him. First he says that his father is 2 months dead, then he says that it hasn't even been 2 months, then he says it hasn't even been 1 month. Time is very slippery in this play. It's going to seem like it contradicts itself all over the place. How fast is time moving? How long has it been? How long between King Claudius's death and the marriage of Gertrude, King Hamlet's death and the marriage of Gertrude and Claudius? Well, maybe it's been 2 months, maybe it's been 1, maybe it's been less than 1. Sort of depends on who you're asking and when. This is something that we should embrace. Don't try to regulate it. Don't let it offend you. Just acknowledge that time is flexible in this play, that time is a little slippery, and try to ask yourself, what is that meaning and how does it work? What does it do in the play? Rather than trying to ask yourself, why is it like this? Or how can we fix it? What's the right answer? Well, there isn't a right answer. The right answer is trying to figure out what is the play accomplishing when it makes time portrayed as that way. Horatio quickly shows up to tell Hamlet the news, and this can be played for a little bit of laughs. You probably won't laugh, but it can be played for laughs when Horatio shows up and says, he's talking to Hamlet, and Hamlet says, I'm looking at the bottom of 665. He's talking about his father and how much he misses him, and he says, methinks I see my father. And Horatio, who of course has just seen a ghost version of Hamlet, is like, where do you see him? And Hamlet says, in my mind's eye, Horatio. Not really. I mean, what are you, crazy? He's dead. And Horatio would say, well, actually, I saw him myself just last night. And they have this conversation in which Hamlet is told about his father's ghost. And he asks very specific questions about it. What was he wearing? And he tries to trip the other people up with trick questions. Like he says, well, what was he wearing? And they say, well, he was wearing his armor. All of it? Yeah, his whole armor from head to foot. Oh, well, then you couldn't see his face. How'd you know it was him? I said, no. He had his beaver up, which is the name that they call for like the visor thing that covers the helmet. He had that up so we could see. Oh, well, did he look at you? Oh, yeah, totally. He watched me the whole time. What was his expression like? And so on. He has very specific questions. Hamlet is a university-trained guy. He's a thinker. And you'll read through that whole conversation, at which point Hamlet agrees to go out and see the ghost for himself with his own eyes. Now Laertes is preparing to leave, and as Laertes leaves, we get a meeting with his family. We meet Ophelia, the young woman of the play, and we meet Laertes' father, Polonius. This can be a scene for a few laughs as well. Polonius is kind of a comical figure. He talks too much. He's very long-winded. And no doubt, like these lectures have come to be, I'm sure you agree. And Laertes is trying to get out of there. He's just trying to get away from home, because the last thing we want to do is hear our fathers give us advice. Right? So this scene becomes a parody of that whole father giving advice to his son kind of trope. But at the same time, Laertes is also giving advice, and it all focuses around Ophelia, and this is the important part of the scene. Because this is where it's revealed that Hamlet has been expressing romantic interest in Ophelia, apparently through gifts or letters. And Ophelia has been receiving those letters and has been responding in kind to Hamlet. Laertes' argument is you can't do that because Hamlet is not going to get to marry whoever he wants to marry. Hamlet is a prince of Denmark, and he's going to marry for politics. He's going to marry whoever his parents need him to marry or whoever Denmark needs him to marry, and that's not going to be you. So you should not indulge this anymore. He specifically tells her, don't sleep with him. You know, he says, look, you're a virgin. You don't want to give up your virginity to Hamlet because he's not going to be able to follow through on it. She lets him go and warns him, well, don't tell me to be good, and then you go and, screw around in Paris. Meanwhile, Laertes' father, Polonius, shows up, and he gives a bunch of advice to his son. Laertes leaves, and then Polonius gives Ophelia a hard time about Hamlet, because he also has heard this stuff about Hamlet. His argument is entirely different. He just thinks his daughter's being a whore. He just thinks that she's sleeping around, or that she's offering herself too easily, and that Hamlet is above her, and their romance is hopeless. He's pretty hard on her. He's pretty cruel, and we see in this scene Ophelia trying to be a good daughter, trying to answer her brother and answer her father, and be honest at the same time. But she's in a pretty hard position because she seems to feel honestly attracted to Hamlet, and she thinks he's sincere. She stands up for Hamlet at a couple of points. Okay. Horatio and Hamlet go out to meet the ghost, and the ghost rapidly appears, and we get the debate over the ghost's true nature. Now, this is an important question for the play. Hamlet will spend much of the play trying to figure it out. The ghost will show up, and the ghost will have a long speech about how he's been in purgatory all this time since he's been killed, that he was murdered, and he describes the exact method of the murder, how Claudius killed him, and so on. And he charges Hamlet with revenge. I want you to kill Claudius in revenge, but don't do anything to Gertrude. Leave your mother out of it. With the argument that the ghost says to let heaven judge her. You don't judge her, let heaven do it. And Hamlet can't figure out if the ghost is truthful or not. The argument is, and Horatio puts it forth, that the ghost might not be a ghost at all. It might be some kind of demon, which is appearing and saying these things to Hamlet to trick Hamlet into doing evil. Because if Claudius is innocent, then Hamlet will kill him and be guilty of murder. Okay. There's a lot of things going on here, but I'll try to walk through a few of them. First, the ghost says he's from purgatory. Okay, there's no purgatory in Protestant Christianity. Purgatory is a Catholic concept. You saw it in Dante, for example. But in a Protestant era, and I'm talking about Martin Luther and the Anglican Church in England at the time, the concept of purgatory has been removed. There is no purgatory. Purgatory doesn't exist. England was a Protestant country, and it was against the law to be Catholic. So what you have is a Catholic ghost in a Protestant play. Hamlet's come from Wittenberg, which is the hotbed of Protestant Christianity. Hamlet is Protestant. But his ghost, the ghost of his dead father, is Catholic. This comes at a time when wars were being fought between Catholics and Protestant over no greater reason than because they were Catholic and Protestant. Is Hamlet morally in the right to get revenge on his father? No. But he will do it anyway. The ghost describes purgatory in some detail, but he says, I can't go into it. I'm not allowed to go into details about purgatory. Think back to Dante and remember what it was about purgatory that made people go to purgatory instead of hell. They went to hell if they acknowledged they had done something wrong. I mean, if they had not acknowledged, if they refused to acknowledge they had done anything wrong, they went to hell. If they acknowledged they had done something wrong, but they had to sort of work it off, they go to purgatory. The ghost's argument is, by the way, and we have pretty good evidence that Shakespeare himself played the ghost on stage, which has led some people to suggest that Shakespeare was Catholic, because the ghost is Catholic, right? Now, we should be careful about putting too much autobiography into these plays. Anyway, the ghost says, I was in my garden where I sleep. I would take a nap in the garden. Always, every day I would sleep in the afternoon in my garden. And I was there when Claudius came up and he poured poison into my ear. And the poison killed me. And then they told everybody that I'd been bitten by a snake. But because I had not been able to confess my sins, I went to purgatory instead of heaven. We all have sins. We always have sins. But you confess them, and that relieves them off of you, and then you can go to heaven. This will come back later in the play. So Hamlet is told this, that Claudius killed Hamlet, killed the old king, and that he should get revenge, and he's told to leave Gertrude alone, and then Horatio and the others show up, and Hamlet makes them all promise to keep quiet everything that they've seen and heard. Because, and here's his argument, I will put an antic disposition on. I'm on page 678. What he means is I'm going to pretend that I'm crazy. Hamlet. Hamlet is constantly watched. There's nowhere he can go in Denmark that he isn't being observed. He's the prince. He walks around the castle. Everybody knows where he is all the time. Every day, every minute of the day. He doesn't even sleep alone, right? There's probably a servant in the room. Now, if you are the prince of Denmark and you're going to try to kill the king, how are you going to possibly arrange that and not have everybody in the castle know what you're doing? His answer is, well, I'll pretend to be crazy. And this will allow me to do things and act things and sort of have my own personal space. And if anybody sees me doing anything weird, they just say, oh, well, it's just because he's crazy. This is his cover, in other words, for his investigation and assassination plot. He makes all the other people swear that they will not tell anyone about what they've seen with the ghost. Okay. And that's the end of Act 1. Let's pause very briefly, and we'll come back and move on with the rest of the play. Okay, we're back for Act 2 of Hamlet. We begin with a scene that's almost always cut in film versions. It's a conversation between Polonius and one of his servants, Rinaldo. And what Polonius is telling his son to do here, or what he's telling Rinaldo to do here, and it's kind of tricky, you might not figure it out in the first read, is he's telling Rinaldo to go to Paris and spy on Laertes. Specifically, I want you to find out what he's doing and if he's behaving himself. How are you going to do this? He tells, I want you to go to these bars and whorehouses in Paris, and I want you to say, hey, I've heard Laertes has been here. In other words, I want you to spread slanderous rumors about Laertes, and then I want you to see how people react. And if they go, oh yeah, that Laertes guy, he's always in here drinking and whoring, well, then we'll know that he's been bad. But if they correct you and they say, oh, Laertes, no, he'd never do that, well, then we know he's been good. This helps to give us a little bit of a sign about how Polonius works. He's not above spreading evil rumors or even trying to entrap his own son. His daughter soon enters, and this scene is almost always kept. In fact, it's expanded upon in most films. And she narrates to her father how crazy Hamlet is currently acting. And she describes this scene, and it's really weird that we don't get to see it. So many filmmakers decide to film it anyway, and they put it in. He shows up to her, and he's acting all crazy for love. Like he's sort of, got his hand pressed to his head, and he's sort of heavy sighing, right? And he won't take his eyes off of her, so that he actually backs up as he walks away from her. He backs up through the room, never taking his eyes off of her. And she describes all this to her father, and her father Polonius is a little surprised because he thought that all of this love stuff from Hamlet was fake. But now, if Hamlet's actually like going crazy for love, maybe he meant something all along. And that would mean that when Polonius told her to reject Hamlet, that Polonius is partly to blame for Hamlet's madness, and that would mean that Polonius was in trouble, right? A lot of what happens in the rest of this act is about Polonius trying to cover his ass, because he wants to make sure that everyone understands that he had no idea that Hamlet was really in love with his daughter. He was just trying to protect everybody. Ophelia, however, confirms that she returned all these letters and stuff, that she was trying to return all these letters that Hamlet had given her, and that's when he started to act so crazy. All right. Claudius calls two young people into the court. These men are Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, but you can call them Timon and Pumbaa. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are schoolmates who went to school in Wittenberg with Hamlet. There's a running joke in the play that the two men are interchangeable. They look alike, they dress alike, and Claudius can't keep them straight, so he calls them by the wrong name. He calls Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and Rosencrantz, and Gertrude has to correct him. Claudius has called them for a particular reason. He knows that his stepson, Hamlet, has been acting strangely, and he wants to know why, so he asks Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to spy on their friend to find out why he's so depressed. Claudius doesn't believe that it's the obvious reason. Right? Not only is Hamlet's father dead, but that his mother has remarried very quickly. Claudius is suspicious that there's got to be another reason, and he sends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to find out what that reason is, and they agree. He tells me, dear Gertrude, the king has gotten word from Polonius. He hath found the head and source of all your son's distemper. Claudius says, Polonius says he knows why Hamlet's so upset. Queen, I doubt it is no other but the main, his father's death and our over-hasty marriage. Okay, Gertrude is no dummy, all right? She knows that what she did was wrong, that she got remarried too quickly, and that she shouldn't have remarried Claudius at all. She knows why her son is upset and depressed, and when she's alone on the stage with Claudius, that's what she tells him. Claudius doesn't buy it. There's got to be more to it. Polonius arrives and gives his defense. Now, in this business with Polonius, you're going to have a lot of jokes and punning about the notion of art and artifice. Polonius talks too much. He's very wordy. He uses long, elaborate sentences and conversations, and he's always trying to say things in a way that make him sound smart. And it infuriates the hell out of Gertrude and Claudius, who tell him, more matter, less art. Just tell me the facts. Just be straight about it. And he says, well, I'm not using any art at all. Okay, this goes back to a conversation that we've had many times in this class already about literature, about language. Should it be easy or hard? Should it be simple and straightforward, or should it be elaborate and arty? Okay? And Gertrude and Claudius come down on the version of straightforward, and Polonius comes down on the version of arty. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Polonius reveals that Hamlet is acting crazy out of love sickness for Ophelia, and he and Gertrude and Claudius all agree that they will arrange a way to spy on Hamlet. They will hide behind screens in the central hall where they know that Hamlet walks reading at late hours of the night, and they'll send Ophelia at him. They actually use the words, I will loose my daughter at him, as if she was some sort of dog or animal. I will loose my daughter at him. And then we'll be able to see how he reacts to her. And from that, you'll be able to see that I'm right, that this is love sickness. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern seek out Hamlet, and they begin to try to ask him about why he's so upset. Now, once again, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern come from college, come from school, so they're all about fancy ways of talking. There's a lot of logic and philosophy and funny, fancy talk here, in which they're all sort of trying to show off how smart they are. They spend a lot of time talking about the power of imagination. We should immediately be thinking of Montaigne and Montaigne's article. When Hamlet says there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so, he's talking about this specifically. The argument is that Denmark is a prison. Hamlet says Denmark is a prison, and they're like, well, it doesn't look like a prison to me. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous here, and you have the run of the country. You're the prince. You can do whatever you want. How can you be in a country where you're the prince and you have everything you could possibly want, and you think that it's a prison? And Hamlet says, well, it's exactly it. I think it's a prison, and because I think it's a prison, it is. Go to Montaigne. This is exactly what Montaigne is talking about in his essay on imagination. They eventually confess that they had been sent for by Claudius, and Hamlet tells them, let me tell you why you were sent for. You were sent here to spy on me because everyone's trying to figure out why I'm so depressed all the time. They seek to cheer him up by the mention that actors have come to Denmark. There's a group of traveling actors who will show up in the play later on, and Hamlet is immediately excited to hear that they've come. Remember what we talked about. Hamlet's a frustrated actor. He loves the theater. And he decides that he will write, you'll see this a little bit later on, he will write a speech, and he will make one of the actors do it in a play. We haven't quite got to this point yet, but what Hamlet decides is that he will use the actors as a way to verify the truth of the ghost. That he will have the actors reenact the murder of old King Hamlet as it was described to him by the ghost. And he'll make sure that Claudius is in the audience. And then when Claudius sees the murder replayed for him live, if Claudius reacts to that murder, Hamlet will know he's guilty and the ghost was telling the truth. But if Claudius just watches the play and isn't bothered by this murder reenactment, then we'll know that the ghost was lying and Claudius is innocent. On 689 and 670, they spend a little bit of time talking about what we now call the War of the Theaters, which is some current stuff that was going on in the time that the play was written, in which open-air adult theaters like the Globe, in which the people that performed were all adult men, had new competition from boys' theaters on religious grounds inside religious territory in the city. And these boys' groups, they were choirs, they were young boys going to religious school, were trained to also put on plays, and their plays were held inside in an enclosed area where the seats were more expensive, and the rooms were lit with torches or lamps or something, as compared to all of Shakespeare's plays, which were all performed outside during the day on a bare stage with no scenery. And Hamlet asks about these players, these actors that are coming to Denmark, and Rosencrantz is going to start telling him about these other child actors and all that competition. This was called the War of the Theaters, and you can Google it. But the short version of the outcome here is that the adult acting companies basically bought the child companies so that they could move into their digs. The acting companies like Shakespeare's moved into those small enclosed indoor playhouses, and that's why playhouses today are still basically indoor playhouses. That's the version of plays and theater that won the war. All right. And there's more discussion about actors and acting over the several pages that follow as the actors show up and Polonius shows up, and they continue, and Hamlet talks to the actors. And one thing to remember, and this comes up in the scene here, is that all of the female parts in Shakespeare's plays were played by men. If the character was a young, attractive woman like Juliet or Ophelia, those characters would be played by boys who had not yet gone through puberty and their voices had not yet changed, and they would dress in women's clothing and they would play the women. Other female characters are generally older and more comical. And I'm talking about characters like Juliet's nurse, for example, or any character that's basically a woman that's played for laughs. Those characters would be played by men who didn't look anything feminine at all. They might even have beards or scruffy, unshaven looks, and they would dress in drag, and they would play it as high comedy. There would be a guy in a dress saying a woman's lines, and it would be funny for that. So when Hamlet talks to one of the actors, and he says, "Oh, you're a lot taller than you were last time. I hope that your voice hasn't gone." This is the actor who would play the female parts for this acting company. Why weren't women allowed on the stage? So in Shakespeare's day, being an actor was considered a very disreputable occupation. There was like homeless person, beggar, and then there was actor. It was one step up, and it was almost criminal. In fact, you had to have a license to be an actor. You had to have a license, and that license had to be authorized by a member of the court. So you would get somebody like the Chamberlain, or the King even, or some prominent lord, to sign your license, and that's what would allow you to be an actor. Because acting was such a disreputable occupation, something that was sinful and awful and scandalous, women weren't allowed to do it, quote unquote, for their own good, right? The idea that, well, women shouldn't be allowed, women are better than this, we shouldn't allow them. The idea that women should be allowed to decide what's good enough for them was something that came along later. But even in Shakespeare's day, women began to slowly move onto the stage. I mean, this is a period of a lot of change, and it seemed to happen very quickly. So, it wasn't allowed for a regular woman to be on the stage, but it was okay for, say, the queen or one of her nobles to play something in a stage in the court. If they wanted to put on a play just for the king and queen, it was okay for the queen to play something. And then later on, people would write special plays just for particular royal families, and then daughters of those families would play parts on the stage. And Milton, who we'll read next in the next lecture, Milton wrote one of these. He wrote a play called Comus, and it was written for a family, an aristocratic family, and the young woman of that family, who probably was no more than 14 years old, had a big part, the major part, and she was basically on stage. And this was written only a couple of decades, within living memory of the play you're reading here. So this stuff changed very rapidly. But at the time that this play was written, all those parts were still played by men. Hamlet asks the players when they show up to reenact a scene for him right now. And what do they pick? They pick a scene from the Aeneid, which we have read and which you will instantly recognize. They pick a scene in which Aeneas is telling Dido the story of how Aeneas escaped Troy and how his father and his mother died, or how his mother died, and how he carried his father out of the city. And so the actor gets up and gives a speech from Aeneas talking about Pyrrhus, who was Achilles' son, and Dido, and so on. And you guys are the perfect audience for this because you will get it. You will recognize everything that's going on here. It's during this part of the play that Hamlet gives direction on how to act. Now this is important because in Shakespeare's time, how did people act? Were they all very dramatic? Did they all stand up and raise and use lots of hand gestures? And did they shout out all the language? And was it all very, very, very Shakespearean, Or was it natural? Was it ordinary conversation that just happened to be using vocabulary that was very rich? Hamlet tells the actors, okay, play this natural now. Don't overact it. Don't melodramatic it. Just make it speak lightly and casually, and consider yourself to be a mirror held up to nature. In other words, we want you to look as natural, as ordinary as possible. This is important because it tells us 400 years later, what did Shakespeare think was good acting? All right. During that scene in which the player is acting out this speech from Aeneas, the actor starts to cry. And when the scene is over and everyone leaves and Hamlet's alone again on stage, he uses this as an example to once again talk about the power of imagination. He says, look at that guy. He's crying. For who? He's crying for Dido. Okay, Dido's a fictional character. Dido never existed. This guy certainly didn't know her. And yet he's crying over her. Now look at me. I've got an actual, honest-to-God dead father who's dead, 60 days or something. And what have I done about that? Nothing. How can this guy cry over Dido, a woman he's never even met, but I do nothing over this guy who was so important to me and whom I loved more than anything? And he used this as an opportunity to criticize himself, to burn himself for his failure to act. And this is where he gets the idea that he'll do what he calls the mousetrap, which is he'll set up this play that will reenact the murder, and if his uncle betrays something to that scene, then Hamlet will know that the ghost is telling the truth. Okay. Once again, the power of imagination. Look at that scene in Montaigne, where Montaigne talks about how if you watch somebody that's got a particular emotion, you start to feel the emotion too. This is exactly what Hamlet is counting on when he talks about how Claudius is going to watch that play. He's going to feel the emotion of the play, and he's going to physically react to it. Okay, that's the end of Act 2. Let's pause very briefly, and then we'll move on. Okay, we're back for Act 3 of Hamlet. This is the center of the play. Lots of very important things happen here. The plot moves forward, lots of turns and twists. Okay? We start off with the spy. Gertrude and Claudius and Polonius are all going to spy on Ophelia as they let her loose in the hallway where they know Hamlet's going to show up. Before they do that, Gertrude acknowledges that she hopes Hamlet is in love with Ophelia. Remember how Polonius was saying, and Laertius was saying, there's no way that Hamlet's going to be able to marry you? Gertrude says, I wanted him to marry you. I still do. I hope that you are the cause for Hamlet's madness, that he does love you, because I thought you'd be queen. This is important, I think. Gertrude, the only other woman in this room, is the person who's sticking up for Ophelia. And then they all hide, and Hamlet comes on, and we get the most famous lines in the English language, other than let there be light, and that's probably to be or not to be, right? It's an important speech. Let's walk through a little bit of it. To be or not to be, to live or to die? That is the question. Is it nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune? Should we suffer when life is crap to us? Or should we take arms against a sea of troubles, pick out a weapon, and by opposing, end them? Should we just take our own lives and thereby escape all the difficulties of life? He's talking about the value of suicide versus continuing on when life is hard. Not just hard, but tragically hard. Awful hard. Right? To die, to sleep. This comparison of death to sleep is an important metaphor in the play. No more. And two other things that we've read too, right? Think about the Divine Comedy. How does that start off? Oh, I fell asleep and I had this dream, right? Okay, you don't go to hell when you sleep. You go to hell when you die. And by asleep, to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. To say that if we go to sleep, all of our cares go away. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. Something everyone would want. And everyone can identify with that. To die. To sleep. But if death is like sleep, and in sleep we dream, what dreams will we have when we're dead? This is where that film, What Dreams May Come, comes from the speech. In other words, what happens after you die? We don't know. This is Hamlet's conclusion. We don't know what happens after we die, and we're desperately afraid of that unknown. And because it's unknown, and because we're so afraid of it, we choose to go on living, no matter how hard life might be, because we're so afraid that whatever comes after death is worse. And that fear, as he puts it, enterprises of, this is thus conscience make cowards of us all, and the native hue of resolution, of decision-making power, is sicklied over with the pale cast of thought, and we think too much. And enterprises of great pitch and moment, great things that we would do in this regard, stabbing yourself, instead turn away, and we never act on them. Hamlet's point is tragic. We don't go on living when things get hard because we're good people. We don't do it because we're strong, noble, or courageous, or any of that crap. We go on living when things get hard because we're afraid that if we kill ourselves, it would be even worse. We are motivated by fear, and the fear makes us inactive. It steals our energy to do what we want. Ophelia shows up, and they have a breakup scene. If you get a chance to watch a film version, I totally recommend it. It's always an interesting scene when this is cast. Ophelia has come with all of the letters that Hamlet has written for her, which she describes in very positive, glowing terms. They were very sweetly written, very loving and tender. And she's going to give them all back. Notice that it's important to remember here that she's not doing this because she wants to. She's doing this because she's been told to do it, and Ophelia is trying to be obedient to her father. Hamlet's behavior towards her is very mysterious, it's cruel, and it's whimsical. He first says he didn't write her anything. She says, well, of course you did. I have them all right here. Then he says, do you think that I loved you? And she says, well, you told me that you did. And he says, well, I never loved you. And we can't seem to get a straight answer out of him. Did he or did he not love her? This is a question that we are invited to ask ourselves. Did Hamlet love Ophelia? He's very hard on her, but sometimes we're very hard on people that we love, especially when we get in a fight or they just try to break up with us. I did love you once, he says, and then he says, I loved you not, right? So, he's being intentionally cruel to her. But at some point, and it comes fairly early, Hamlet figures out that Polonius and possibly Gertrude and Claudius are watching. Out of nowhere, he says to Ophelia, where is your father? He knows that Polonius is watching, and he puts Ophelia in a tight spot. Now, what are you going to do? Who is it? Are you going to tell me the truth, or are you going to lie for your father? Is it him or me? And Ophelia, she just wants to, she doesn't know what to think, right? So she knows that her father's right there listening, and that's where she's got to go home tonight. So she says, at home. She lies. She says, she's at home, my lord. And then Hamlet goes berserk because she has lied to his face. And he tells her to get out of the country. He says, go to a nunnery. Now, what is up with all that? Because he repeats it time and time again. He says, get thee to a nunnery, go. On and on and on about the nunnery. His charge is that the last thing Ophelia wants is to get pregnant. He talks about this a lot, and that's what he says that why she needs to get to a nunnery, is that she doesn't get pregnant. Well, who's going to make Ophelia pregnant? if it's not Hamlet. Uh, he goes off about this notion of illusion and outer self versus inner self. He accuses her of creating a false face. He's talking about makeup. He's talking about cosmetics. But it's a metaphor for all of the falseness that people present. He says God gave you one face, but you make a new face, physically, literally, on your face. And you have a funny way you walk, and you seduce men, and you trick them into saying things that they don't mean, and you play on their emotions, and he gets really furious at her until she breaks down. And then he makes a few threats to Gertrude and Claudius, who he knows are listening, and then he storms off, and the others come back on, and Claudius says, well, that doesn't look like anybody who's lovesick to me. He's really angry, but he's not treating, if he was sick for love, he would be treating Ophelia much nicer. And Claudius decides to send Hamlet to England on a mission, like an ambassadorial trade mission. He says, England owes us a bunch of money from tribute. Remember we talked back in Beowulf and earlier ideas about the Danelaw, the fact that the northern part of England had been ruled by the Danes for a long time. This is a reference to that. That we've conquered a bunch of England. England owes us a bunch of tribute money, so we'll send Hamlet to go collect the tribute money, and maybe he'll be better when he comes back. We'll give him a vacation. Okay. The mousetrap sequence follows. Hamlet gives acting advice to the actors, and then before that happens, we have a scene with Horatio and Hamlet. This is important because Hamlet reveals to Horatio why I can be honest with you. Why can I be truthful to you, but I have to lie to everybody else? And the answer is a perhaps unexpected one. He says, look, the fact is, Horatio, you got nothing I want. You don't have anything that I want or need, and therefore, because you don't have anything I need or I want, I have no reason to lie to you. You're not rich, you don't have power, you don't have anything. So I can be honest with you because you are poor and humble. Slowly the other people arrive. Polonius, Claudius, Gertrude all arrive. Ophelia all arrive for the play. And we have a little exchange between Hamlet and Polonius where they talk about Polonius' previous experience as an actor and how he played Julius Caesar and was killed by Brutus. This would have gotten tons of laughs from the Shakespearean audience because Shakespeare had just written Julius Caesar. His play, Julius Caesar, was written right before this, and there's a lot of common themes. If you read Julius Caesar in high school, you could find a lot of common themes, even from something as simple as the ghost and asking a lot about revenge and so on. Anyway, and the actor who played Julius Caesar in that performance was also the guy playing Polonius in this. And the guy playing Brutus in that version, Shakespeare's version of Julius Caesar, was a guy named Richard Burbage, who is currently playing Hamlet. So when Hamlet is talking to Polonius, and Polonius is saying, oh yes, I played Julius Caesar, Brutus killed me, everybody in the audience would get that, once again, Brutus, Burbage, would kill the guy playing Caesar. Right? It would be like a famous actor and actress who've been in multiple movies talking about their past movies together in character, right? Like Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie being in a movie together and talking about marriage. You're like, wait a minute, right? It would be like that. There's an in-joke, and everybody in the audience would get it because they all knew these guys. Okay. Shakespeare's not above sex jokes. We have this idea of Shakespeare as a kind of high intellectual art. But when Hamlet goes over to Ophelia, puts his head in her lap and says, "I'm thinking of country matters," it means exactly what it sounds like. Okay? The players put on their version of the play, in which first a king and a queen get married, and then the queen says, "Oh, and I'll never love anybody else after you, and if you die, I'll never remarry." Gertrude's watching this. She's right there in the audience. Then, at this point, Hamlet says, "What do you think of the play?" And she says, "Oh, the lady doth protest too much." She's making too many promises. She's making promises she can't keep. And Claudius is asking about this play because he starts to see that there's a rival to the throne who kills the king with poison poured into his ear. Plays in Elizabethan England were censored and controlled by the government. And every play had to get permission to be performed. And if it was offensive to the throne, it was banned, and the creator of that play could be thrown in jail for writing something that offended the throne. And you're seeing this when Claudius says, "Have you seen the script for the play?" He asks Hamlet. "Is there any offense in it? Is there anything that's, like revolutionary or anything that's gonna insulting to our throne?" And Hamlet's like, no, they're just actors. It doesn't mean anything. We're real and they're fake. I mean, how could anything fake ever affect anything real? Okay, I'm being sarcastic here, right? Because it's exactly what this play is all about. But Hamlet tells Claudius, no, they're just play acting. None of that matters to us. But of course, that's his whole point, is that it does matter to us. Well, Claudius watches the play, and when he sees the poison poured into the king's ear, he reacts. His guilt comes to the surface, and he stands up and he ends the play. He says, "Bring me some light," because the play would have been performed in the darkness of the courtroom with just torches or something. He says, "Bring me some light," and maybe he storms out. He walks out of the court, and the play is interrupted. And Hamlet is ecstatic because the ghost has been proven right. And he grabs a musical instrument and he dances and he plays and he jokes with Horatio and says, Did you see it?" And Horatio says, yeah, I saw it, I get it. But Gertrude and Claudius are offended by what they have seen. Keep in mind that Gertrude doesn't know that Claudius killed old King Hamlet. But she's plenty offended by this business about the queen swearing never to marry anybody, which of course she immediately does in this fake version of the play. In the Mousetrap, the queen marries the guy who kills her husband. So she's pissed off at Hamlet because of that. And Claudius is pissed off at Hamlet because he's pretty sure that Hamlet knows about the murder. And Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are sent to find Hamlet and to tell him that his mother wants to see him. Your mother wants to see you. And there's an exchange between Rosengil and Hamlet in which Hamlet tells them, he plays word games with them for a while, and then he grabs this flute, a recorder. Remember the recorder? You had to play it when you were in grade school, like a really super simple flute, like a clarinet or something that's just got little stops on it. He grabs this recorder, and he says, "Here," and he gives the recorder to Rosencrantz. "Play this." And he says, "Well, I can't. I don't know how." No, play it. It's easy. He says, "It's as easy as lying." and Rosencrantz says, I don't have the skill." And Hamlet says, "Well, you would play me. You would play me, and your fingers would mark all of my little holes up and down the scale, and you would make me do whatever you want me to do. Do you think that I'm easier to play than this flute?" It's a great little bit. And And he tells, tell my mother I'm on my way, but, I'll be there eventually. And he tells off Rosengil, and he goes off on his way. Claudius now understands that Hamlet poses a direct danger to Claudius's health and well-being. He believes that Hamlet knows about the murder and that Hamlet wants revenge, and so now Claudius is in self-preservation mode. He sends Rosengil away, and then he tries to pray. He goes to a chapel, and he prays. He tries to confess. Again, remember we said earlier in Act 1 that the issue of confession would come back? Well, here it is. Claudius gets down on his knees, and he tries to pray. The trouble is that he's not sincere in his praying, and he knows it. I'm on page 711. But oh, what form of prayer can serve my turn? What prayer is going to do me any good? Forgive me my foul murder. Should I say that? That cannot be, since I am still possessed of the effects for which I did the murder. My crown, my own ambition, and my queen. I still have all the things that I killed to get. As long as I have those, I'm not really sorry. I mean, if I really want forgiveness, I've got to give up the crown that I killed my brother to steal, and I have to give up the queen that I killed my brother to marry. And I have to give up my ambition, which I killed my brother to satisfy. Until I do that, my prayer doesn't mean anything, and God's not going to listen to me. Claudius is not a dummy. Yes, he killed his brother, the most ancient of sins, right? It's Cain, all over again. Yes, he killed his brother. But he knows that it was wrong, but he can't bring himself to give up what he got. But he tries. He says that great line. He has that great line. Bend stubborn knees. And he forces himself down onto his knees and he tries to pray. And this is when Hamlet finds him. Hamlet's going through the castle halls and he sees Claudius praying. And he says, oh, this is it. He's all by himself. Nobody's around. I'll just stab him. And then he'll go to heaven. Wait a minute. That would be scanned, he says. Rewind that. Think about it. I'm going to kill this guy who killed my father. And in return, I'm going to send him to heaven. Because he's praying. He's confessing. My father, when my father died with all these unconfessed sins on his head, and so he went to purgatory or hell. I should do that with Claudius. I should wait until he's got sins on his head. I'll wait until he's just come out of my mother's bed. Then I'll kill him, and I'll send him to hell. Okay. This is Hamlet's big mistake moment, right? Because it's not Hamlet's call who goes to heaven and who goes to hell, right? There's a guy up there who's going to decide all that. And Hamlet is overreaching by trying to play God and decide who goes to heaven and who. He's trying to play the judge. He decides not to do it, and he goes off. And then Claudius has a few lines in which he says, it's no good. I don't mean it. My prayers don't work. In other words, if Hamlet had just stabbed Claudius and hadn't stopped to think about it, if he had just killed Claudius, Claudius would have gone to hell, or purgatory at least, right? Because his prayer wasn't effective. His confession wasn't sincere. But Hamlet had to try and take things into his own hands, and he had to decide that he was going to play judge and play God. And as I have often told my students as we read this play, if Hamlet had just killed Claudius right here at the end of Act 3, the play would have a happy ending. Because everything bad that happens from here on out would have been avoided. Hamlet would kill Claudius. He would get to be queen. He would marry Ophelia, and, everything would be fine. But because he chooses not to, everything goes downhill. What follows is the closet scene. This is the scene in which Hamlet confronts his mother in her bedroom. It's a complicated scene. Again, if you watch a version of it, it's totally worth watching, but be aware that different people will do it in different ways. Plot-wise, the thing to remember is that Polonius is hiding behind a curtain in the room, eavesdropping on Hamlet. He's sort of caught in the room when Hamlet arrives, and so he hides in the room, and Gertrude's talking to Hamlet. And she's angry because Hamlet's offended Claudius. She says, "Your father have you much offended," meaning Claudius. And Hamlet says, my father have you much offended, meaning old King Hamlet. And this leads into a long extended debate in which Hamlet compares old King Hamlet to Claudius. And he calls old King Hamlet Hercules and a god. But Claudius is, this revolting little pygmy in comparison. And Hamlet gets very outspoken and very angry about over this whole comparison. At some point, this fight almost always ends up going to the bed, and there's some kind of wrestling around on the bed, and this is where a lot of the Freudian reading of the play becomes most obvious. Now, Hamlet's long harangue of his mother about how you were doing the wrong thing sleeping with Claudius when you should... Hamlet's argument is, look, basically it's about age. Look, you're old. You shouldn't be having sex anymore. You're old. Old people aren't allowed to have sex. Hamlet's got this sort of irrational fear of old people having sex, or especially his mother. And he says, look, your husband was dead. You should have just, lived alone for the rest of your life. And it's not entirely fair. I mean, Gertrude's not that old. She's got a long life ahead of her. Why can't she marry somebody? Especially somebody who we find loves her very much. Claudius is totally in love with Gertrude. He's completely head over heels for her, and he can't live without her. So Hamlet's a little unfair in this scene, and that's not lost on a lot of people that write or cast it. Well, he gives her hell for a couple of pages, and then the ghost returns to remind Hamlet about the job he's been given. And this is important because you remember what the ghost told him about the mother? The ghost told him, don't mess with Gertrude. Just leave her alone. Leave her for heaven to judge. The ghost returns, and Gertrude can't see it. This is unusual, right? Because Horatio, Bernard, Marcellus, they all saw the ghost. Everybody else saw the ghost, but for some reason Gertrude can't see the ghost. This has created some uncertainty in the play that's led some people to wonder what's going on. Maybe Hamlet has gone crazy and there isn't a ghost. He's inventing it. Maybe something else is going on. Anyway, the ghost shows up. Hamlet talks to Gertrude and tries to calm himself, and he says, "Look, I'm going to have to go." Oh, we missed an important part of this scene. Right after Hamlet comes in the room and he's arguing with Gertrude, Polonius, who's hiding behind the screen, gets afraid that Hamlet's going to get violent, and he starts shouting for help from behind the screen. "Help, help," like calling the guard. And Hamlet thinks it's Claudius behind the screen. And what was he just saying? "Oh, I'll wait to kill Claudius until Claudius is just coming out of my mother's bed." Well, what other man is going to be in Gertrude's room, he's thinking. It's got to be the king. It's got to be Claudius hiding behind the screen. And so he runs the guy through the curtain. He's got his sword. He's never without his sword. And he kills Polonius. Well, at this point, Hamlet understands that Claudius is going to be angry at him. Something bad is going to have to happen here. So he urges his mother, "Look, don't just behave better. Don't sleep with Claudius. I gotta go. I gotta take care of this dead body. But, be good. And Gertrude seems convinced by the end of this whole scene that she will obey Hamlet in that sense, that she will repent, that she repents of her decision to marry Claudius. Hamlet knows that he's about to be sent to England, and he knows that he's going with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and he doesn't trust them. That's how this act ends. All right, let's pause there. We'll come back and do Act 4. Okay, we're back for Act 4. First thing that has to get resolved is this whole business with Polonius and the dead body. Claudius sends Rose and Gil out to search to find the dead body. There's this very funny bit where they find Hamlet, and he's like, oh, you'll never find him, but if you wait too much longer, then you will nose him as you walk up the stairs to the lobby, meaning I buried the body underneath the stairs, and he's going to start to stink, and you're going to smell him eventually, so let me just tell you where he is. Then they bring Hamlet to Claudius, who has his confrontation with Hamlet. Now, they're both thinking, right? Claudius, I think that Hamlet knows that I killed his father. And Hamlet's thinking, I think that he knows that I know that he killed my father, right? But they can't talk about that out in public because Roz and Gil and everybody else doesn't know, right? In the prelude to this scene, Claudius reveals one of the reasons why he doesn't just have Hamlet killed. He says the fact is that Hamlet is much beloved by the people of Denmark. They love him, and his mother loves him, and I can't live without her. We'll get to this again later on, but Claudius admits that, I love Gertrude, and Hamlet makes her happy, and I'm really careful. I don't want to do anything to Hamlet if I can possibly avoid it. Well, he decides to send Roz and Gil with Hamlet to England, and he writes a letter for the King of England that Roz and Gil are to deliver. And the letter says, England, as someone who owes us tribute, we're giving you this mission. I want you to execute Hamlet. At this point, so then Hamlet and Roz and Gil are leaving the country, and they're exiled to go on this journey. And Hamlet is pretty sure something fishy is going to go on, and Roz and Gil aren't talking. But they come across Fortinbras and Fortinbras' army. Remember him? Yeah, he goes back. Okay. What we find is this. Now, Fortinbras was originally going to try to invade Denmark. But Claudius talked to his uncle, who runs Norway, and the uncle persuaded Fortinbras not to do that and to instead invade Poland. But to get to Poland, he has to march through Denmark. Now, this makes no actual logical geographical sense. Do not pull up a map and try to figure any of this out because it makes no sense. Shakespeare didn't care. But Fortinbras says, I have to march through Denmark to get to Poland. Okay, fine. So we're going to give the army of Norway permission to travel through Denmark. And that's what's going on as Hamlet, Roz, and Gil are leaving the country. And they come across this army. And it's a huge army. And Hamlet's like, oh, wow, they must be like conquering all of Poland. And somebody tells him, one of the soldiers says, no, they're fighting over this little tiny piece of land that I wouldn't give $5 for. And it's not going to enrich Poland or Norway more than $5 to own it. And people are going to die. Thousands of people are going to die fighting for this nothing. And once again, this becomes an opportunity for Hamlet to consider Fortinbras or one of those other sons against, or some other person against Hamlet, and whether or not Hamlet is behaving properly. Just as with the actor crying over Dido, crying over nothing. He says, look at Fortinbras. Fortinbras is going to go to war over nothing. And he's going to kill 1,000 people over this nothing. Look at me. I got a father that's been murdered. And what am I doing? Nothing. If Fortinbras can kill 1,000 people over a tiny piece of land, then by God, I ought to be able to kill one guy in revenge for my dead father. And he burns himself for his inaction. And he says, from this moment forward, he says, my thoughts be bloody or nothing worth. My thoughts, they're not worth anything if I'm not thinking about how to kill that guy. And he sounds resolved. As soon as he's gone, remember, time is very slippery here. We see Ophelia back in court. We don't know how much time has passed, but clearly some time has passed. Ophelia has now gone mad. The death of her father, and, one would presume, the way that she was treated by Hamlet. She has a very beautiful little speech at the end of that confrontation scene with Hamlet, the breakup scene, where she talks about how Hamlet was once so high, a great and noble person, once so high, has now fallen so low. And that, the mistreatment from Hamlet, combined with the murder of her father, and possibly the fact that her brother is not around, leaving her essentially alone and stranded, has caused her to lose her mind. She appears in the court singing nonsense songs. There's actually a meaning behind all the songs, but they're all sort of random. And the people that are there don't really understand what's going on with her. This is all made more poignant because Laertes has found out. Remember Laertes who went off to France? Laertes has found out that his father, Polonius, is dead. And he's returned to Denmark in secret because there's a mystery around Polonius' death. Remember, how was Polonius killed? He was killed by Hamlet. Well, Claudius doesn't want to let that out because he knows the people love Hamlet. And, you know, he doesn't want the scandal. So he apparently, and this is all sort of discussed, kind of beating around the bush, but apparently Claudius had Polonius sort of secretly buried without any kind of ceremony, and he hasn't told anybody how Polonius really died. Claudius has been covering it up. All right. So Laertes bursts into the courtroom. This is actually Claudius's great moment in the play, because Laertes breaks into the courtroom and he's convinced that Claudius killed Polonius, because he can't figure out any other explanation for why Claudius would have concealed the facts of the death and buried him quietly without ceremony. Well, you must have done it for some reason. And Laertes is outraged. He's the revenger. Once again, another son out for revenge, right? Fortinbras, Laertes, Hamlet. And compared to Hamlet, who, is constantly overthinking everything, Laertes, he does the opposite. He doesn't think it through at all. He bursts into the room, and apparently the people outside also know that something is fishy with Polonius' death, and they're actually cheering for Laertes. They're cheering Laertes on, like, let's make Laertes king. Okay, which is absolutely crazy, because Laertes isn't in the line of succession at all. He's got no claim to the kingship, but apparently the population of Denmark are, they're easily swayed. Well, anyway, Laertes bursts into the room. He's got his sword out. Gertrude is there. And Laertes puts his sword at Claudius's throat and threatens to kill him. And Claudius is cold as ice. He is totally cool. And he tells Laertes very calmly, did you love your father? Do you want to kill everybody or just the people that were involved in your father's death? What about people that are grieving for your father, who liked him and mourned for him, who are sorry for him? What do you want to do to them, right? And he very carefully walks Laertes through all of this. And Laertes is like, I really want to stab you. But Claudius is so obviously unafraid that it makes Laertes wait long enough for Claudius to explain, look, I didn't kill your father. I appreciated your father, and I'll tell you all about who did kill him, and then you can go kill that guy. Right? Okay. Soon after this, we learn what's happened to Hamlet. Hamlet apparently had a whole adventure off stage. His ship with Ross and Gil on it were attacked by pirates. It's just such a random plot twist. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. They were attacked by pirates, and Hamlet was captured by the pirates. And he spent some time with the pirates. But eventually, they let him go, and now he's returning home, having never been to England. We later find out that what happened is, in addition to all of this, is that Hamlet knew that Rosengil had a secret letter. So he stole the letter, he opened it, found out what it read, found out that it ordered his own execution at the hands of the King of England. So he made a fake letter, sealed it, because of course he's the prince, so he had the royal seal, sealed it, put that fake letter back into Rosengil's belongings. What did that letter say? The letter said, don't kill Hamlet, kill Rosengil. So Hamlet puts this fake letter by which he plans on Rosencrantz and Guildenstern carrying their own execution orders to the king. Well, Hamlet gets kidnapped by pirates, but Rosengil, they escape, and they go on back to England, and we find out got executed. Okay? Hamlet killed these two guys. For what? For spying on him, basically. Hamlet's guilt gets ever larger once he kills Polonius, because Polonius didn't deserve to die. Polonius was just a guy in the room. Once he kills Polonius, things just get worse and worse and worse in this play. Ophelia goes crazy. Rosengil get executed. And it goes on. Okay. Claudius's moment about Gertrude, where he talks about how much he loves Gertrude, is on 730. She is so conjunctive to my life and soul that as the star moves, not but in his sphere, I could not but by her. As much as Gertrude loves Hamlet, so I love Gertrude. He and Laertes hatch a plot. They found out that Hamlet's alive. He didn't get killed by the pirates. He didn't die in England. So Claudius is an overplanner, just like Hamlet. They're both thinkers. And he begins to plan how the murder will take place, the revenge will take place. He says, look, okay, Hamlet killed your father, so you can challenge Hamlet to a duel. Now, it's not supposed to be a deadly duel. You're both aristocrats. No one's supposed to die in these duels. You'll be using blunted swords, but accidents happen, right? So we'll make sure that there's a sword that's got a sharp tip on it, and you can accidentally stab Hamlet. That ought to do it. And Laertes says, I can do that one better. We need a plan B. I bought some poison. I'll put the poison on the sword, so all I've got to do is scratch him, and he'll die. Claudius says, okay, that's good, but you know what? We need a plan C. I'm gonna buy some poison too, and I'll get a cup of wine, and we'll put the poison in the cup, and we'll get him to drink the poison, like in celebration of a victory. Like if he starts to win, because your plan requires you to stab him. But what if you can't stab him? What if he's too good? Then, if he's winning, we'll toast his victory, and we'll get him to drink from the cup, and I'll kill him. And Laertes and Claudius agree on this. This is the plan. 3 means of execution, all of which go wrong. Ophelia's death is passed on by Gertrude in another one of these scenes that happens off camera. Gertrude comes in and tells about how Ophelia has died. She has drowned. she was at the side of the river picking flowers, and she fell in, and then the water filled her dress, and she just kept singing songs and blub. Was it an accident? Was it suicide? This whole notion of drowning Ophelia has become a 21st century trope, talking about young women in American culture and the immense pressures and anxieties they suffer under, and the high rate of suicide among young American women. And that metaphor is taken from here, from this moment of the play. Where Ophelia, with her father dead, her brother gone, her lover mad or having rejected her, she goes mad, and in that madness takes her own life. Okay, well, Hamlet wasn't around for this act, so it went fast. Let's pause, and then we'll come back and finish off the play. Okay, we're here to finish off the last act of Hamlet. It starts off with the burial scene. Now, there's some grave diggers. Your version of the play, it's important to note that there are multiple versions of Hamlet. I mean, this play is 400 years old. Shakespeare was not alive when it was published. It was only collected after his death, and there have been multiple, and no one's really quite sure which version of Hamlet would be, quote, the authentic or the real version. We have competing versions with small differences. Your version in this book has a very long gravedigger scene. There's a lot added here, which is often cut in other versions. So the scene goes on for some time. Partly this is because Shakespeare's acting company had a guy in the acting company who was famous for doing these sort of comedy parts. His name is Will Kemp. And he would have been a famous comedic actor in Shakespeare's company. Well, if you've got a guy who's a great comedian, you got to write a part for the comedian to play. Well, there hasn't been a whole lot of need for comedians anywhere else in Hamlet, which is, pretty somber. So you got to give him a scene, and it's got to be a hell of a scene, a good long scene, because people want to see Will Kemp, right? And he's good. So he would be playing one of these clowns, the first clown, and first he and a couple of the other clown are talking, and then Horatio and Hamlet show up, and then Hamlet has a long conversation with the clown where they talk about the graves. And this is all a upfront confrontation with death. And I say upfront because at one point Hamlet grabs the skull, and we have this sort of famous Hamlet moment of him looking at the skull and talking to it, right? That I knew him well, Horatio moment, which has become so ingrained in our visual culture. Hamlet has a contemplation and thinks about and talks about death, and specifically that it comes to all of us, and we don't really look ahead for it or plan for it. And in this case, it comes back to him because he's talking about this skull, and he's playing around with this skull, and he asks the gravedigger, whose skull is it? And the gravedigger says, well, that's the skull of Yorick, the king's jester. And Hamlet knew Yorick. He's like, oh, I knew him. I used to play with him when I was a kid. I would play on ride him on his back like a pony, and we would do all these things together. And now he's dead, and I'm looking at his skull, and it makes me want to vomit. My gorge rises at it. I can feel that taste of vomit in the back of my throat. And they're thinking about this when they see a funeral, because of course the gravedigger is digging a grave. They see a funeral happening, and Hamlet's like, oh, who is that? Is it the king? But it's not. We see Gertrude, Claudius, and Laertes, and then we realize that it's Ophelia who's dead. And Laertes has this big melodramatic moment where because Laertes is all about emotion. Laertes is not a thinker, he's not a planner, he's all about his acting on his emotions, his passion. And Laertes jumps down into the grave and picks up the body of his dead sister and starts talking to it. I loved you more than anything. And there's this big debate going on around the body because she's a suicide, and that means that she cannot be buried with Christian burial rites because she, as we remember from Dante, she's going to hell, right? Because you can't kill yourself. It's a sin. So, so she's not getting the full burial that a young woman of the court would normally get. Anyway, Laertes jumps down in her grave and he's holding her, and this is where Hamlet shows up, and he like steps out from behind a gravestone or something, and Laertes just goes ballistic on him, and they get in this fight, and Hamlet insists now that he loved Ophelia. And for those of us that read the breakup scene, or all those times when he was a jerk to Ophelia, are now thinking, well, it's a little late. But he says, I loved Ophelia, and he tells Laertes, look, however much you want to exaggerate how much you loved her, I'll exaggerate you 10 times higher. If you want to say that you loved her as high as a mountain, I'll tell her that I loved her as high as Olympus. That my love was so high it would put out Zeus's eyeball. And he kind of intentionally exaggerates it. He says, you can go on and on and on about how much you loved your sister, but you're never going to love her as much as I did. And there's a lot of male competition going on here, kind of who loved her more sort of bullshit, which doesn't really help Ophelia at all. She's still dead. Anyway, Horatio tries to choke Hamlet, and eventually they're pulled apart, and Hamlet, everyone sees that Hamlet has returned, and then we move on to the next scene, and Hamlet and Horatio are talking, and Hamlet has already told us he can be honest with Horatio, and this is where he explains what he did, how he killed Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, that he swapped their letters out, and when he explains how he's killed Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Horatio's kind of shocked. He's like, wow. He says, why, what a king is this? Because Hamlet's just killed 2 dudes in cold blood. And, anybody who's read Machiavelli can see what we're talking about here, right? I mean, you just straight up killed these guys. And that's the sort of thing a king needs to be able to do, is what Horatio's getting at, right? And Hamlet's like, oh, why is this so surprising? And Hamlet has changed. His time away has changed. And he returns. Remember what he said at the end of Act 3? My thoughts be bloody or nothing worth. That from this point forward, I'm here to kill Claudius. And this is what he explains to Horatio. He says, he that hath killed my king and whored my mother, popped in between the election and my hopes, who stole my crown. In other words, I should have been king, but he took my crown. Thrown out his angle for my proper life, and the guy who's tried to kill me, shouldn't I want to kill him in return? Don't I have every right to kill him in return? This is a very different Hamlet. This Hamlet is resolved. However, he says, I did do wrong by Laertes. I insulted him. I made him angry. I've only always loved Laertes. He's a good guy. But I was upset over Ophelia's death, which I didn't expect to happen. And so I've got to make it up to Laertes. Laertes has challenged Hamlet to a duel. Now, we know this is part of the murder plot, but Hamlet just thinks it's Laertes trying to satisfy his honor. And Hamlet says, look, so I'll duel Laertes. I'm better than everybody thinks. It used to be, Laertes is the favorite. Everybody thinks Laertes is going to win, because Laertes is well known for being an excellent swordsman. And Hamlet says, look, I've been doing nothing but practicing for months. So I'm much better than they all think. I think that I'll win, actually. And especially because they bet odds, like they placed odds on Laertes. So all I got to do is, like the odds are 3-2 or something. Like all I've got to do is, not lose completely, and I'll be okay. And then we'll worry about Claudius. Hamlet's thinking ahead. There's a conversation with a guy named Osric who comes in and delivers the story of the wages. There's a lot going on here that we don't really need to get into, but what's going on here is this sort of conversation between Hamlet and Osric about appearances and about sincerity, that what someone The Osric is portrayed as a kind of lying courtier who will say and do whatever pleases the king instead of what's true. So when Hamlet says, oh, take off your hat, and he takes off his hat, he'll put it back on, puts it back on. And this is an example of Hamlet highlighting the fact that people don't have any convictions in Denmark. Same thing happens in a much earlier scene when he's talking to Polonius and says, look at that cloud. What does that cloud look like to you? And he's like, oh, I really wouldn't know, Hamlet. Well, doesn't it look kind of like a lion? Oh, yes, it looks totally like a lion. Well, I think it looks like a whale. Oh, it's totally like a whale. The point is that a lion and a whale look nothing alike. But Hamlet can make Polonius say whatever he wants because Polonius just wants to please Hamlet. And so it is with Osric. All these people who, they just want to please. They don't really have any internal convictions at all. They just they have this outside appearance. They'll make it say or do whatever you want them to say or do. That's what's going on in this scene with Osric. All right, well, anyway, eventually Hamlet, he's challenged to the duel. He's ready to fight the duel, and Horatio's like, I don't know, I got a bad feeling about this. And Hamlet has this great line where he says, you know what? It doesn't matter now at this point. It doesn't matter. He says, if it be now, if my death is now, then if it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. If my death is now, well, then I won't have to worry about it coming later. And if it's not going to come later, well, then it'll come now. And even if it doesn't come now, it is eventually going to come. We all die eventually. He says the readiness is all. What matters is that you're ready to die, that you're at peace with that moment. And because it could happen at any time, you have to be ready for that moment at any time. Hamlet confronts Horatio, and he basically cops insanity plea. He says, I'm sorry that I offended you. I was crazy. I didn't mean it. I was just upset. It wasn't Hamlet that offended you. It was that crazy guy that I briefly was that offended you. And Horatio says, lying, he says, well, I accept that, and I know that you're sincere, but for purposes of honor, I have to duel you anyway. So let's duel. And Hamlet believes this and says, okay. And Hamlet's honestly entering this duel in a good, with an honest, sincere desire to, I'll fight my best. Laertes will get his stabs in, and then we can put this behind us. Because I am sorry that I killed Polonius. I didn't mean to. It was a bad thing. It was an accident. He has every right to be angry. Okay. The fight plays out. Once again, another great example of watching the film. Just get a film version. The duel, the events of the duel are hard to figure out from the reading the play. You need to watch it. And you'll see Laertes and Hamlet. They're just dueling, and Laertes is losing. And everyone's sort of surprised at this because no one thought Hamlet was any good with a sword. Then Laertes gets desperate because he feels like, well, maybe I'm not going to be able to stab him. Maybe I'm not going to get a hit on him with the poisoned sword. So he just takes a cheap shot, and he stabs Hamlet when Hamlet's not looking. And they get angry, and they fight. And at some point, Laertes drops his sword, and Hamlet gives him his sword and takes Laertes' sword. So now Hamlet's carrying the poisoned sword, and Laertes knows that it's poisoned, and now he's suddenly afraid. And Hamlet stabs him with it. But Laertes, but there's nothing that Laertes can do about it. He can't say, oh, the sword is poisoned. Meanwhile, while that's all been going on, every time somebody scores a point, Claudius gets the poisoned cup and says, oh, let's drink. And Gertrude says, oh, drink. And Hamlet's like, no, I'm working. I'll drink later. I'm fencing now. And so they set the poisoned chalice aside. And at one point, after the second or third point, Gertrude picks up the poisoned chalice and says, here's to Hamlet. And you have to imagine Claudius at that moment, right? Imagine yourself with Claudius. He adores her. He's already just told us, it's like, I can't even live without her. What does he do? He says, Gertrude, don't drink. Okay, Claudius is the drunkard. he can't. He has no authority. When he tells somebody not to drink, no one's going to listen to him because he's a complete hypocrite. If Claudius wasn't a drunkard, if he wasn't a person famous for drinking, then if he told Gertrude, don't drink, she might say, oh, yeah, you're right. You know what? I'm not going to drink. But because he's a drunkard, he says, don't drink. And she's like, of course I'm going to drink. You know, who are you to tell me not to drink? And so she drinks. And Claudius watches in horror as the woman he loves drinks poison. And he's the only one that knows it, right? It's done well. It's a brilliant moment. Well, anyway, so she sits down and she's usually sort of waving in her face. She's slowly being poisoned. Laertes collapses. He's poisoned. And at this point, Gertrude's probably goes into seizures or whatever. And everybody in the crowd starts to get alarmed. And Laertes knows everything. And he confesses. He says, the sword that I stabbed you with and that you stabbed me with was poisoned. And the queen has drank poison. And it's the king's fault. The king is to blame. And he says this because he's dying. And he's come to understand that he's in the wrong. Laertes is feeling guilt for what he's done. And that the sword being used against him is a kind of divine vengeance. He's like, oh, okay, God is stabbing me. God is killing me because I participated in this plot. I was rash. I was reckless. I insisted on trying to get revenge. I should not have. And God is killing me. And he confesses everything to Hamlet. At this point, Hamlet knows, oh. And then Gertrude dies. And Hamlet's, if he hasn't already gone berserk, he has, by this point, he goes crazy. And he grabs the chalice, and he already has the poisoned sword, and he pours the poison down Claudius's throat and stabs him. Just to, make sure he's dying. It's often noted, and it's a little funny, that the first person to be poisoned in this scene is Hamlet, but he's the last one to die. Okay. So a good dramaturg, a good director has to find a way to make that work and make it plausible. Like maybe he just gets scratched on the hand or on the foot or something, but Laertes gets stabbed much closer to the chest, so the poison works much faster. Gertrude drinks the poison, but she drinks a whole cup of it or something maybe. Anyway, Claudius, he's the last guy to get poisoned, but he dies instantly, probably because Hamlet ran a sword through his chest. Okay. So now everybody's dying, and Hamlet's already dying. He collapses to the ground. Horatio runs over to him, and they have a few last words. That's the basics of the plot. Horatio is like, oh, I'm totally going to kill myself. And Hamlet's like, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't kill yourself, because I want you to tell my story. I want you to grieve for me. He says, if you've ever loved me, then I want you to dress in black and for me and go about your life in pain and in grief for me for a little while to show your honor for me. That's how you honor me, not by killing yourself, by grief. And he does. And then at the same time, Fortinbras and the English ambassador show up because Fortinbras has just coming back from the war with Poland. And he shows up and he's just figuring on, I guess, depending on what version you see. In the 4-hour version, Fortinbras is conquering England, conquering Denmark. He comes in with an army and they conquer the place. But that's not what we see in the play. In the play, Fortinbras shows up, and the English ambassadors are also there, and Horatio is there, and Fortinbras sees all these dead bodies. Gertrude, the queen is dead, the king is dead, the prince is dead, and Laertes is dead. And Fortinbras says, well, this is ugly. What the hell happened here? And Horatio says, well, it's a long story, but I'll tell you. And Fortinbras says, well, the people here remember me. I used to rule here for a while. So I think I'm just going to take over. And Horatio says, well, I have some things to say about that, because before Hamlet dies, Hamlet says, give Fortinbras the throne. Hamlet embraces Fortinbras as a role model and says Fortinbras should rule. That's a good prince. That Fortinbras, he's a good guy. Well, so when Fortinbras says, I'm going to take over the kingdom, Horatio is going to tell him later, after the play's over, that's what Hamlet wanted. The English ambassadors are there saying, we just came to tell you that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. That's what the king, that's what Claudius ordered us to do, and we did it. And Horatio says, well, he never actually told you to do that, but he's not here to hear your command anyway, hear your order. And then Fortinbras orders that Hamlet's body be picked up and paraded around and given a full military burial with all honors. And the last words of the play are, go, bid the soldiers shoot. Go give the 30-gun salute or whatever to tell everybody that the prince is dead. Well, as you can see, a lot of things that we've been talking about throughout the play are recurrent. This idea of illusion versus truth. This idea of revenge or death, and our confrontation, how we respond and react to death. Questions of the power of imagination and how it can make us believe or things or even feel things. This whole question of play acting. There's the proper conduct for a prince. Claudius is a dedicated Machiavelli reader, right? He's totally following that book. What is Hamlet? How about Fortinbras? How about the other noble actors in this play? What does all of this have to say about love? What about Ophelia? What about the women of this play? Anyway, there's a lot going on in the relationship between fathers and sons. What is that relationship, and how problematic is that? How do we resolve that? Well, we've talked a lot. It's been a pretty fast run, but I hope you found it useful and informative. And I'll see you next time for Paradise Lost.